This is VOA Africa.
Hello, I'm Esther Githui-Ewart. It's Monday, June 28th. Welcome to Africa 54. We continue to work remotely because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But what hasn't changed is our commitment to bringing you the latest and most important news from the African continent and around the world. This is today's Africa 54. We begin our broadcast in East Africa, where 3 employees working for the Spanish branch of Medecins Sans Frontieres have been killed by unknown perpetrators in Ethiopia's Tigray region, according to the medical charity. MSF-Spain said in a statement Friday it lost contact with a vehicle carrying the team on Thursday afternoon. MSF officials say their vehicle was found empty and their bodies were found a few meters away. It is strongly condemning the attack. It has also identified the victims as Emergency Coordinator Maria Hernandez, 35, from Madrid, Assistant Coordinator Johannes Halefom Reda, 31, from Ethiopia, and their Ethiopian drivers Tedros Gebremariam Gebremikael, also 31. The employees killed are among at least 12 aid workers reported killed since fighting erupted in November between Ethiopia's military and forces loyal to the Tigray People's Liberation Front. A local Somali security official says an estimated 30 people are dead following an Al-Shabaab attack on a town in the country's semi-autonomous state of Galmudug. The insurgents used car bombs in the assault on a military base in Galmudug's Wisil town, located in central Somalia, triggering a fight with government troops and armed locals. A military officer in Galmudug told Reuters that 17 soldiers and 13 civilians were killed in the fighting. Al-Shabaab claimed responsibility for the attack via a statement on its radio Al-Andalus. The United Nations has strongly condemned the attack on one of its temporary operating bases in the Gao region in Mali. The assault left 15 peacekeepers from Germany injured, according to preliminary UN reports. A UN spokesperson, Stéphane Dujarric, said Friday the attack took place while a casualty evacuation process was underway. This attack follows a Thursday attack with another improvised explosive device on a different UN patrol in the same area. Dujarric says that incident did not result in deaths. He said the UN mission strongly condemns the attack. Authorities say suspected suicide bomber was blown up in the Democratic Republic of Congo on Sunday when his improvised explosive device was detonated in a busy intersection in eastern city of Beni. It was the second blast in Beni on the same day. No one was killed in the 2 incidents, apart from the suspected bomber in the second blast. Earlier on Sunday, another explosive device was detonated in a Catholic church in Beni, injuring several people. So far, no one is claiming responsibility. Beni's mayor says a curfew has been declared in the city of more than 230,000 over concerns that there could be another bombing attack. Hollywood actress and special envoy for the UN's refugee agency, Angelina Jolie, is praising Burkina Faso's efforts in helping people displaced by Islamist militants. But rights activists say Burkinabe authorities have also been fueling the conflict with hundreds of detentions without charge and even extrajudicial killings. Henry Wilkins reports from Ouagadougou.
Deep in Burkina Faso's war-torn Sahel province lies the Gadubo refugee camp. It was rebuilt after Islamist militants burnt much of it to the ground last year. Around 11,000 refugees live here. They fled Mali, a country plagued by armed groups linked to the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, to another beset by the same problem. Hollywood actress Angelina Jolie, who is special envoy for the UN's refugee agency, UNHCR, recently visited Gadubo to mark World Refugee Day and praised Burkina Faso for its treatment of the displaced.
The truth is, we are not doing half of what we could and should to find solutions to enable refugees to return home or to support host countries like Burkina Faso, coping for years with a fraction of the humanitarian aid needed to provide basic support and protection.
Her visit took place in the country's only major refugee camp. Official sites for the country's 1.2 million internally displaced people, IDPs, are off limits to the media due to a government ban. Burkina Faso is one of the world's most neglected humanitarian crises, according to the Norwegian Refugee Council, and is struggling both to ward off terrorist attacks and protect IDPs. But its security forces have been accused by a local human rights group, the Collective Against Impunity and Stigmatization of Communities, of atrocities against IDPs. A victim of one attack described watching his friends being killed in front of him by security forces.
When they had finished gathering the young people, they burned everything, houses as well as crops. Then they took 2 people and shot them dead. One of us was beaten to death right next to me, as close as you are to me now.
Human Rights Watch says abductions and extrajudicial killings of civilians are common in Burkina Faso.
Since 2019, Human Rights Watch has documented over 200 cases of extrajudicial killings by Burkinabe armed forces in the context of counterterrorism operations. This is an extremely worrying trend, which feeds, of course, in recruitment efforts by armed Islamist groups.
IDPs live in constant fear, says the UNHCR.
In the conflict-affected areas of the Sahel, communities literally live with the fear of the next attack. And that's what's driving up the number of people forcibly displaced. And with that, of course, comes higher needs for basic humanitarian services.
Burkina Faso's Defence Ministry did not respond to requests for comment on the accusation of extrajudicial killings and abductions. Henry Wilkins for VOA News, Gadubo Refugee Camp, Burkina Faso.
South Africa is tightening COVID-19 restrictions for 14 days because current containment measures are insufficient to cope with the speed and scale of new infections. The announcement was made by President Cyril Ramaphosa in a televised address on Sunday. The country, the worst hit on the African continent in terms of recorded cases and deaths, is in the grip of a third wave of infections. It recorded almost 18,000 new cases on Saturday, approaching the peak of daily infections seen in a second wave in January. Under the new measures, all gatherings are prohibited. There will be a curfew from 9 p.m. to 4 a.m., and the sale of alcohol is being banned. Schools are closing, and restaurants will only be able to sell food for takeaway or delivery. A Nigerian man who was persecuted in his home country for being gay found refuge in the United States. Now, Edafe Okporo runs a New York City shelter that aids members of the LGBT community, and his writing is giving him an even bigger outlet for his activism, as VOA's Dile Diko reports.
In this Harlem refugee shelter, housed in an Episcopal church, all are welcome. The shelter is run by a gay African man named Edafe Okporo. He migrated to the U.S. in 2016 from Nigeria's Delta State to escape hate crimes. After being granted a refugee status, he was homeless and spent his nights in shelters. In 2018, Okporo saw a job opening that introduced him to RDJ Refugee Shelter, the city's only shelter for asylum seekers and refugees, and was hired as its director. The shelter typically holds 10 people, almost all from the LGBTQ community.
They will connect people to English as a second language services. We connect people to job readiness program, and sometimes educational program. People want to go back to school.
The shelter opened in 2011. Some people stay for a night, others for months. Abdullah, a gay Saudi refugee living at the shelter, explains what brought him to the U.S.
My sexuality and my non-belief both would result in a swift execution by the laws of my country. So I had no choice but to leave. This shelter and what Edafe is doing is honestly amazing. I can't imagine how I would have survived last year if it wasn't for them.
The shelter also welcomes political refugees and migrants. Luis left his family in Mexico to find work and considers himself lucky to have found room at the shelter.
I think I am in a good place. My idea is to progress, study more, find a career to get ahead in this country.
Okporo received a $200,000 award last fall recognizing his work at the shelter. He he wants to use the money to help displaced people and create a global platform for people suffering from discrimination.
In Africa, it's still very difficult to be gay. Homophobia is deeply rooted in religion, and Africans are very religious. Back home in Nigeria, I have two friends that died. They died because of homophobia.
One of Okporo's friends was HIV positive and stopped his treatment after a nurse told him he was sick because he is gay. Another gay friend was beaten to death.
Most people that are homophobic, they don't see us as humans.
Okporo's activism has expanded to a blog, and he's writing a book about asylum, his experience as a refugee in New York, and the challenges of being a religious black gay man from Nigeria. He's leaving the shelter this month to focus on his writing. In New York, Dili Diko, VOA News.
Derek Chauvin is facing 22.5 years in prison for the murder of George Floyd, the case that triggered international protests and calls for greater racial reckoning. The former Minneapolis police officer was convicted on 2 charges of murder and 1 charge of manslaughter in April. VOA's Robert Raphael has the details.
As sentenced for count 1, the court commits you to the custody of the Commissioner of Corrections for a period of 270 months. That's 270. That is a 10-year addition to the presumptive sentence of 150 months. This is based on your abuse of a position of trust and authority, and also the particular cruelty shown to George Floyd.
As Derek Chauvin listened, Judge Peter Cahill said that he did not make his decision based on public opinion and that he recognized the pain the case had caused everyone inside the courtroom and elsewhere. Earlier in the hearing, Chauvin addressed the Floyd family briefly, stopping short of issuing an apology.
At this time, due to some additional legal matters at hand, I'm not able to give a full formal statement at this time. But very briefly, though, I do want to give my condolences to the Floyd family.
But members of Floyd's family told the court that words cannot take away their pain.
I wanted to know from the man himself, why? What were you thinking? What was going through your head when you had your knee on my brother's neck? Why when you knew that he posed no threat anymore, he was handcuffed, why you didn't at least get up? Why you stayed there?
Floyd's nephew later said the judge's sentence is not true justice for his uncle.
When you think about George being murdered in cold blood with a knee on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, execution style in broad daylight, 22.5 years is not enough.
Right. Go ahead.
We were served a life sentence. We can't get George back. Gianna can't hug George again.
I can't breathe on the
This cell phone video of Chauvin placing his knee on Floyd's neck outside a store in Minneapolis in May 2020, along with several other high-profile killings of black citizens in recent years, sparked worldwide protests, particularly in the U.S. Chauvin still faces federal civil charges in Floyd's death. He is expected to appeal both his criminal conviction and his sentence. Robert Raphael, VOA News.
We would like to hear what you think about Africa 54. Join the discussion on Facebook. Our address is Africa 54. We're also streaming our broadcast live on Facebook. Please watch and share our show with your friends. Also check out our headlines 24/7 on voaafrica.com. Still to come, security is high on the agenda as U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken meets the European leaders and the Pope. We'll be right back.
Be sure to join me on the next Straight Talk Africa when we talk about reparations and redress as Namibia negotiates with Germany on compensation for colonial-era genocide. We ask how much is enough to make amends for atrocities and other sins of the past. We'll look at lessons from other parts of Africa and the world and hear from Namibians about what this means for the future of their country. Reparations, remorse, and redress on the next Straight Talk Africa.
Welcome back to Africa 54. The Biden administration's $1.2 trillion bipartisan infrastructure agreement on spending to rebuild roads, bridges, and other projects faces a critical week that could determine the scope of U.S. infrastructure investment. Michelle Quinn reports.
Now comes the hard part. The fragile agreement between President Joe Biden's administration and a bipartisan group of senators on U.S. infrastructure spending must win even broader support from lawmakers in both parties. What remains uncertain is whether the limited bipartisan plan is what will get done, or if a more ambitious and likely more polarizing Democratic-backed bill can pass Congress. The bipartisan plan calls for $1.2 trillion to be spent over 8 years on roads, bridges, railways, public transportation, and airports, as well as improvements to the power grid and the expansion of broadband internet access. To help pay for these projects, the plan reportedly relies on unused pandemic aid and other means. On Saturday, Biden walked back a statement he had made that appeared to link his support for the agreement to the passage of another spending bill on so-called human infrastructure, such as elder care, education, and child care. That $6 trillion package would include tax increases on the wealthy. Some Democratic leaders have said they are not happy with the slimmed-down bipartisan package.
I can't vote for some small subset that, the infrastructure train leaves the station and child care gets left on the platform. Green energy gets left on the platform. Billionaires don't have to pay gets left on the platform. It's that all of the pieces have to move because ultimately it's one deal.
To surpass a filibuster in the evenly divided Senate, the bill will need 60 votes. Senator Joe Manchin, a Democrat who was part of the bipartisan group, says there's time for working on a bigger infrastructure bill.
We have two tracks, and that's exactly what I believe is going to happen. And we've worked on the one track. We're going to work on the second track. There's an awful lot of need.
Senator Rob Portman, a Republican who also worked on the deal, says the smaller infrastructure package is a chance to get something done.
People are looking for us to get something done, specifically on infrastructure, but more generally to work together to solve big problems.
The White House and Democratic leaders are hoping both packages will be passed in July. Michelle Quinn, VOA News.
U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris traveled to El Paso, Texas on her first official visit to the U.S. southern border on Friday. Her focus, following up on her Guatemala and Mexico trips and seeing firsthand the detention centers that hold migrants and how U.S. Customs and Border Patrol is managing the situation. VOA's Celia Mendoza has the story from El Paso, Texas.
Vice President Kamala Harris arrived in El Paso, Texas on Friday for her long-awaited visit to the southern border with Mexico as part of the Biden administration's plan to stem the flow of immigration. Harris traveled with Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas.
So the work that we have to do is the work of addressing the cause, the root causes. Otherwise, we will continue to see the effect, what is happening at the border. It is going to require, as we have been doing, a comprehensive approach that acknowledges each piece of this, informed also by the recognition that the United States is a neighbor in the Western Hemisphere, and not only do we have a reason to concern ourselves with the root cause issues because of what we see at the border, but also because we live in that neighborhood.
Across the border from El Paso is Ciudad Juarez. Here, the Honduran migrant Manuel Orlando Pinto Medina hopes to convey his message to Harris and Mayorkas.
I would like them to know that many of us leave our countries out of fear, necessity, poverty, lack of security. It's not easy to abandon your home.
El Paso Republican Party Representative Bobby Peña views the visit as a political move.
The reason why the vice president is coming is simply because President Trump said he was coming.
Peña is referring to an announcement from former U.S. President Donald Trump, who has plans to travel to the border on June 30th. Peña also highlighted Harris' controversial statements during her recent trip to Guatemala and Mexico.
If Trump had never come, she might have never come. She always says, yes, I'll go. She's not interested, just like she's not gone to Europe. She's not interested.
Vice President Harris has reiterated that her priority is to focus on seeking solutions for the root causes of migration. For Fernando Garcia, director of the Border Network for Human Rights in El Paso, this visit comes at the right time.
It was about time that she came to listen to our communities. We have thousands of children in a military base called Fort Bliss. Those children do not have to be incarcerated. They must be with their families. Hopefully, she will solve that.
Harris visited the Border Patrol processing centers on Friday, where migrants, including unaccompanied children, are held after entering the United States. Celia Mendoza, VOA News, El Paso, Texas.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrived in Vatican City Monday after being warmly welcomed in France and Germany. Blinken is meeting with the Pope and top Italian leaders as he participates in ministerial meetings on Syria, defeating Islamic State fighters, and he is to attend a G20 meeting. VOA senior diplomatic correspondent Cindy Sain has more on his European trip from Paris.
French leaders welcomed Secretary of State Antony Blinken with open arms. Blinken spent much of his youth in Paris and speaks French fluently.
Donc, Antony, welcome back.
Foreign Minister Le Drian said everyone is glad America is back. Despite the bubbly receptions in Paris and Berlin, though, serious world problems caught up with Blinken, including a U.S. intelligence assessment suggesting that Kabul could fall within 6 months after U.S. and NATO forces depart Afghanistan on September 11th.
But we're looking very carefully at the situation on the ground in Afghanistan, and we're also looking very hard at whether the Taliban is at all serious about a peaceful resolution to the conflict. We continue to be engaged on the diplomacy, but actions that would try to take the country by force are, of course, totally inconsistent with finding a peaceful resolution.
Blinken also met with French President Emmanuel Macron before departing Paris Sunday for Rome. He and Italian Foreign Minister Luigi Di Maio will co-chair a meeting of the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS. Experts say the IS threat is acute in Afghanistan and parts of Africa.
The threat is morphed and mutated and gone to new places, as you mentioned, in Africa, and that's going to be high on the agenda. And I think, again, the approach there is not simply just military. It's what could be done in a range of spheres, including helping people who are displaced by the conflicts in Africa, as well as sort of the ideological aspect of trying to defeat ISIS.
The State Department says Syria remains a very big concern, with tens of thousands of women and children in humanitarian camps, subject to security issues and ISIS efforts to exploit the camps to recruit the next generation of fighters. On Monday and Tuesday, Blinken will have an audience with the Pope at the Vatican and then visit the Italian cities of Bari and Matera for a G20 foreign ministers meeting. Cindy Sain, VOA News, Paris.
No Paris, Rome, or Latin America. The most popular honeymoon destinations became hard to reach for average American couples during the pandemic. So where do newlyweds go to after getting married? Valentina Vasileva has the story, narrated by Anna Rice.
Tay and Lisa Britova got married in January 2021 during the second coronavirus surge in the U.S. Instead of a large reception, they only had 10 guests, social distancing in place, and no plans for their honeymoon. They had dreamed of going to Europe or Latin America, but decided to wait because of the pandemic.
It's such a headache right now. Borders open and close again. Tests are needed. The results expire quickly. Well, it's all very complicated. So we decided not to think about the honeymoon for the time being. For now, we hope to have a big reception in October 2022, and then maybe a proper honeymoon in 2023.
In January, Yevgeny and Lena Semyonovy celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. They had planned to celebrate at a Maryland restaurant with family and friends, but large gatherings were prohibited because of the pandemic. So they bought cheap plane tickets and headed to Puerto Rico.
The beaches of Vieques were all ours. Vieques is a small island of Puerto Rico's eastern coast. They were limiting the number of tourists, and the beaches ended up being empty.
Travel agents say many are still willing to travel, but are concerned about the rising costs as restrictions are being lifted and the tourism industry tries to recover profits lost during the pandemic. Agents say many are opting to stay closer to home. Before, popular honeymoon destinations included the Maldives, Europe, and Southeast Asia. Now, many Americans are heading to Mexico, Hawaii, Costa Rica, and other Caribbean destinations.
Rates are much higher this year than they've ever been in the past. So it's not necessarily a bargain. Like, there really is not travel bargains right now, and like anywhere you go. So it is, they are seeing that they're spending the same than they would spend on a larger scale honeymoon. It's just closer, it's easier with flights, it's not as extensive.
Travel agents add that during the pandemic, traditional honeymoons have turned into the so-called mini-moons that don't last as long as usual and often involve a short trip to a neighboring state. Bigger trips are being rescheduled for 2022 and 2023. There are so many rescheduled trips that travel agents warn by the end of the pandemic we could see a honeymoon boom with a shortage of specialized suites, venues, and hotels.
The other thing that's happening is everybody that was booked for 2020 has already rebooked for 21 or 22. That means that there's years of buildup of people who have already arranged a trip and are now pushing it to the next year or the following year.
However, the pandemic brought some good news to the marriage industry. Since reception parties were much smaller, couples spent a lot less on their big day. Travel agents say they're spending those savings on their honeymoons and celebrating in style. For Valentina Vasileva in Washington, Anna Rice, VOA News.
That's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, we thank you for watching.